Venezuela was once the richest country in Latin America. It has the largest known oil reserves in the world, and its democratic government was once praised worldwide. But today, the country's economy and democratic institutions are in a state of crisis. To begin, it is important to understand Hugo Chavez's political legacy that led to Maduro taking power. Hugo Chavez was the extremely popular president of Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013, and is the one that brought the Bolivarian socialist revolution to the country. He transformed the country's political and economic landscape by nationalizing industries and funneling enormous amounts of money into social programs.
After his death in 2013, his vice president Nicolas Maduro assumed power. Maduro was no Chavez. He clearly lacked the charisma and political popularity, constantly trying to emulate his predecessor, but did not experience the same success. Maduro did not have Chavez's asset of oil money. Like many oil-rich countries, Venezuela suffered from a dependency crisis curse since the 20th century. And under Chavez, the economy heavily relied on oil money and was never diversified. Since late 2014, low oil prices and stifling government regulations on currency have produced huge shortages of basic items, including food and medicine, and have caused the world's highest inflation rates. The country is suffering from a malnutrition crisis, and malaria is ravaging the population. Maduro's popularity has plummeted, and anti-government protests have been increasing in frequency, size, and intensity. Maduro has resorted to a heavy hand in order to stifle them. This begs the question as to why people are still loyal to Maduro despite the economic crisis. First and foremost is the maintenance of our democratic values. Maduro legally won the presidency in the national elections. Secondly, Chavismo redistributed the oil wealth, providing vast social programs and reivindicating the poor. Sectors who have been loyal to Chavez have become unified. Although there are critics of Maduro, they won't support the opposition because they believe that the opposition has been bought off by imperialism. Essentially, they don't blame the president for the economic crisis, but blame it on an economic war waged by the US to destabilize the country. Juan Guaido was sworn into office by the National Assembly, where he immediately called the Maduro government as being illegitimate. His claims stem back to the highly criticized 2018 presidential election, in which key opposition were barred, key figures avoided the election, and there were accusations of rigging. Guaido invoked Article 233 and 333 of the Venezuelan Constitution, which essentially claims that the country has no legitimate elected president at the beginning of the term due to the contested election. On January 23rd, he swore himself in as the interim president of Venezuela. Maduro continued the same economic and political policies as Chavez, despite the decline in world oil prices that sustained the crisis. This has driven Venezuela into the verge of collapse, entering into an economic and humanitarian crisis.
The arguments put forward from the available policy options. The first option is to support Maduro, which would lead to the loss of U.S. oil exports, which would mean economic crisis will probably deepen given the nature of the petrostate. The second option, to support Guaido, would undermine democratic precedent. It does not ensure that Venezuela will emerge out of its crisis. He could be as ineffective as Maduro. Theoretically, he would call for a re-election with international mediation, but this is not guaranteed and probably won't happen since Maduro won't step down. Now let's look at the evidence in support of each side. Maduro's claim of legitimacy is that he legally and democratically won the election. He has the support of the military and the lower class, and in terms of the military, within the high command there is a deeply impregnated commitment to Chavez and his ideology. Maduro has been known to purge non-loyal members, and many in the military have implicit connections to drug trafficking. They fear trial and imprisonment if Maduro falls. Guaido's claim of legitimacy is that Maduro's poor governance of the country, the economic instability, and faulty democratic elections. His legitimacy is also claimed through invoking Article 233 and 33 in the Constitution. That being said, the Venezuelan Constitution is extremely complex, and both articles only apply if the presidency is vacant, which technically it is not depending on your political lens. Therefore, the legitimacy of the constitutional arguments depends on which position you take.
The likely outcomes and impact on foreign policy. If Maduro wins, the US will likely maintain their sanctions. The Venezuelan economy will sink further unless they find another source to buy around 40% of their oil exports, revalue their currency or fix the currency crisis, and diversify their economy so that they're not completely dependent on oil exports. If Guaido comes into power, whether or not he stays in power is in question. One may question whether he abides by his legal obligation and calls for an election as required by the constitutional acts he invoked. One may also question whether or not he's actually a good leader that can implement meaningful change. Venezuela's situation is spiraling out of control. It will take exceptional leadership to set the country back on the right path.
The impact on overall foreign policy. Depending on whether Maduro remains in power or is replaced by the opposition, will have an impact on the political leaning of Venezuela and the region in general. As of now, Venezuelan policy has been to continue the Bolivarian socialist revolution form of government, which would most likely end if Maduro is ousted. The change in power could follow the current trend in Latin America of the rise of right-wing conservative governments that tend to adopt US-friendly foreign policy, with Mexico and Bolivia being key exceptions.